students of mine who are present here, like I hope this gives you a way of thinking about some of the stuff that we've been talking about in class, including the challenges of historiography and how exactly you go about stringing up historical facts into a causative sequence. And what we've been talking about in our foundations class about the Marxist framework for history, and how whether or not and how much that could be applied in historical analysis, and the stages of modes of production, and how we should understand world history. So it was wonderful to listen to, and I mean, I'm going to open it up for questions, but the first question I just had, and I'm going to just ask it. I was E.H. Carr. Where is he in all this, and why does he not enter into this group? And also the other thing is, I mean, I was the year 1948 came up a lot, and I was thinking a lot happens in world history at the time. The partitions of the subcontinent, Israel, they're happening thereabouts. The creation of like refugees and citizens on a mass scale. How much and does that affect his analysis, of how the world works?
Would you like me to answer those, or would you want to take some more questions? I don't mind.
I think let's start there. Are there? Yeah, let's start.
Okay, I'll start. So E.H. Carr is not a Marxist, sort of, not really a Marxist, and so he sort of falls outside the scope of any of these discussions. Carr is really, I mean, in a sense, I think what the Communist Party Historians Group would have liked to have done is write a book like Carr did, What is History? I think What is History is 1961, if I remember correctly, but somebody can perhaps check that. Which was after 56, and by this stage, other people were going their own way. Hobsbawm's Age of Revolution is 1962. So things were beginning to come out, but nothing like What is History. Now, Hobsbawm was really enthusiastic about What is History. He thought What is History was great, and he said so in public. He reviewed the book. But E.H. Carr really, as far as I'm aware, didn't figure in any of these discussions, at least not centrally. The records are obviously about the things that were written down and also the things that seemed to be a priority. One assumes that E.H. Carr was not perceived to be a priority. So E.H. Carr and Hobsbawm, the relationship between the two, I'm not 100% sure about. Really interesting to explore that. But I think What is History became the book that they never wrote, many of the members. In terms of world history, no, it's really astonishing the degree to which it doesn't penetrate. The CPhD doesn't deal with the 20th century for obvious reasons. The 20th century is very complicated and difficult for communists in this period. There are a lot of things that are making people extremely uncomfortable. Anti-imperialism should be fairly straightforward as a cause, but it really isn't there. They really are having very focused historiographical discussions about strictly historical questions. And the birth of capitalism is what really concerns them. They are interested in what's happening in Eastern Europe, but beyond that, as far as I can tell, no. Hobsbawm himself, on the other hand, did follow closely and did know what was going on. And there's some of the interviews I've done, some of the stuff I've read suggests that in that period when he was both teaching at Cambridge and teaching at Birkbeck, so 47, 48, 49, 50, that is what he would talk about with his students when they got together in coffee shops and when they sort of had meetings and so on. The informal discussion. People have told me more than once, I remember talking about India, about Palestine, or about the kind of colonial situation in the late 40s and early 50s. So Hobsbawm was aware of it, but CPhD, just not there.
There was a question.
All right, so I came in 10 minutes late, and I don't know if you said this at the beginning, but if you didn't, then please do, which is this, that. So when you embark on a project like this, which is, to write, and how do you call this, a biography or not?
Intellectual biography.
An intellectual biography of, arguably the best known historian of the 20th century and so on and so forth. how do you approach the subject? So before you get into the archives, and of course then the stories that come out are fascinating, as were the stories that you said today. But what were your starting intuitions like, and how did you look at the subject? Because for someone like me, if I the first thing I have is awe about the writer, and that would obviously cut back against any rigorous intellectual history to be done about that historian. So so just a little bit of a personal reflection on what you thought when you started off, and that'd be very interesting.
Yeah, so the origins for this project lie really in the moment of his death, at which point I'm just generally curious as to why very little has been written about Eric Hobsbawm, and why this giant of historical writing has had virtually no critical attention at all. Contrast that, for instance, with E.P. Thompson, where there has been a much greater critical scrutiny for what is, in a sense, a less substantial body of work, certainly in terms of volume, but I think even in terms of range, Thompson's very brilliant, but much more limited. So that got me thinking. So that was one line of reflection, and the other had to do much more with the work that I was doing at the time on French politics. And so my training was as a historian of post-war France, and a lot of what I worked on was intellectual life in France. So that field was very familiar to me, and at the time, just after finishing my PhD, I was pitching these projects to funders and to places I was applying to jobs. I was pitching a project about French Marxism, right? So having written about non-Marxist currents in French intellectual and political life, I was pitching this project on what's a legacy of French Marxism. And I think over time, over the course of about 6 months or a year, the two fused, with the result that the poor old project on French Marxism got abandoned, and I began to start thinking about Hobsbawm. Now then, the second question you ask is a really, really important one. There were two big issues facing me. One was the knowledge which I had right at the start that I would not be the only one doing this, and that there would be many others, and there is indeed an authorized official kind of biography coming out. So that was the first question, so how do I deal with the competition? A classic historian's question. And then the other thing was, how do I deal with somebody who actually fashioned his own life so carefully? He wrote a memoir. Hundreds of thousands of people have read that memoir. When I do interviews with people, they tell me bits of the memoir back to me. So there's a very strong self-fashioning. Not only that, but Hobsbawm also wrote the history of his own generation. So it wasn't just him, because he was the one who lived the longest. So the CPHG, the article he does in 78, that is the foundational article for anybody who wants to write about the CPHG. People like Victor Kiernan, most of the people on that list die before Eric Hobsbawm. I think they all died before Eric Hobsbawm. And as a result, he writes their obituaries. He tells their stories. The entries in the Dictionary of National Biography are entries written by him. So he also plays a very important role in fashioning what it meant to be a British Marxist historian of his generation. So those are the kind of two big questions that I faced. I think then, in terms of how I've dealt with that, one is just put the blinkers on, throw the memoirs to the other side of my office and not think about them, and sort of really be blind, in a sense, to all of that baggage. So that's one thing. And the other thing is to try and break away from the man himself. That's what I'm sort of doing here in this paper, and talk about his generation, his peer group, his ideas, and try to restore some sort of normalcy to the great man. I don't think there's a smoking gun in Hobsbawm's, papers or anything. Nothing that I found that was, oh my God, this transforms our view of Hobsbawm. No. But what there is actually a lot of material that helps us to understand where he came from and why he was so successful. But it's an ongoing conversation, and I have that conversation with myself all the time. So one part denial, one part hubris.
It's very interesting. If I just could very briefly follow up, because I was just wondering, because not just about 2 years back, I don't know, he probably is a historian of repute these days, but so Dipesh Chakraborty tried to write something about Jadunath Sarkar, the great historian of India, whatever that he was, but there was an interesting technique in which he tried to position position himself in conversation with the person whose intellectual biography you're writing. So I'm just wondering if in your writing, if you were to imagine that Hobsbawm was sitting across your office and wondering what you're doing to his legacy by, by saying the right thing, which is that, you belong to the intellectual milieu that you come from, that there's no, rare specific genius, although there might be, who knows. I wonder if that's an exercise in your head, that, that while I'm saying this, I wonder what, Hobsbawm, who died not so long ago, would have been thinking about what I'm doing to this, to the legacy that he has crafted for himself. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. I was joking about this with a bunch of friends the other day, saying that this should be a hashtag. What would Hobsbawm do? And I have that sort of thought all the time. I don't think it's possible not to have that thought. The only thing I'd say, I suppose, about me specifically is that I really, really never expected to be writing about one person. Right? If you knew me through my other writing, you know that I like big ideas, and actually I like very broad things. And so the idea that now I'm basically going to be obsessed with this guy for the next sort of decade is a very strange, from a sort of personal perspective, is very strange. So I think having a conversation is not a bad technique. How then you reproduce that in writing, that would involve a change in narrative style, which I don't know whether it'll be in the book, but maybe I'll do some other kind of writing about Hobsbawm, or conversations with historians, or conversations with my inner historian. The project that I'm doing right now, so the reason I'm here is because I've got a substantial chunk of money to go and travel around different parts of the world looking at his legacy. And again, there's a sense of, okay, this is actually, I'm in conversation with, I land in Delhi, and I think, oh, well, he arrived in Delhi in 1968, and these are the people he met, and now I'm meeting them, and so you're bound to sort of invest your subject personally.
Yep. First and then second.
Who's first?
Anish is first.
I have 4 questions.
4. I
Okay, so you touch a bit on this when you talk about sort of the excitement of being in this collective arguing and being able to change the entire sort of direction of his academic career, and so these are all the ways in which the CPHE is so crucial to him. But I'm wondering about sort of whether something of a specific excitement of being in a communist group might come through a contrast with a couple of different other kinds of collective projects. One, I guess, would be the collective project we call academia. So how is it that Hobsbawm is so happy to jettison his Fabian what is it that he doesn't find in, as it were, is what I'm asking, in sort of the university end of things? But also the collective historians project across the channel, as it were. Annals being the obvious one that has a huge impact, obviously, on Hobsbawm later on. So how are these similar? How are these different? And how can they help us think a little bit about what is the excitement of this being a communist group? Because neither of those two, of course, are linked to those political causes. Secondly, one of the more surprising elements of this was how much Hobsbawm seems to be loath to toe the party line because of all the sort of surviving CPHE historians. Hobsbawm is usually considered the one who stays in the party, stays faithful to the party, is prepared to toe the line, is prepared to even lay down the line later on in a variety of ways. In 56, of course, while others break, Hobsbawm stays. And he talks about this. So I'm curious about sort of how these two bits fit together. Third was about, I love the 4 sort of points that you laid down, and number 3, of course, was this question of Englishness. And you see it front and center, for instance, even in a historian as great as Thompson. And Hobsbawm stands apart from that. So I'm curious about the sources of, am I right in seeing this in Hobsbawm being wary of this Englishness trope? And what are the sources of that? Emigre, something else? I'm curious about that. And fourth, the element of the CPHG's sort of practice that I always personally found really intriguing. I first encountered it, I think, in Harvey Kay's work, and then again in Thompson's own work, was about adult education, how critical it was. And I'd like you to sort of expand on that end for Hobsbawm, whether it was, whether it wasn't, as it were.
Okay, for clearly structured questions, I'm feeling like A.L. Morton. That's good. But no ideological rectification is taking place, unfortunately. But maybe later. I think in relation to his PhD on the Fabian movement, it's not a very good PhD. It doesn't really hasn't aged well. It's quite clunky in a lot of his generalizations. He clearly had no patience for the Fabians in general, and that made it difficult for him to write anything that would be meaningful and useful. I've also seen, and this is kind of fascinating, I've sort of seen some of the peer reviews of his thesis, which he uses then to apply for fellowship. So R.H. Tawney, the historian, is sent his thesis and the thesis of another chap called Henry Pelling, who writes about the Communist Party later, for review. And Tawney really says, Hobsbawm is bright, but this PhD is not that great. He's going to go further probably than Pelling, but this thesis itself doesn't show it. So I think that he knew that. The other thing that's worth saying, for those of you who are not aware of this, is that doing a PhD was not really necessary at that point in British academia. The PhD was very much a sort of German import, and I think probably because of his Central European heritage, he felt that doing a PhD was important, but not everybody did. And so leaving behind your PhD and not publishing it was actually okay. In terms of the Annales School, incredibly important. That's a large part of what the chapter on making contacts is about. And the reason I didn't put it in Friends is because by and large, in the 40s and 50s, he is very much a junior learning from the Annales School. So he does go to France in the 50s. He's within those circles. He's invited to the École Pratique des Hautes Études, so the sort of the precursor to the École des Hautes Études, which is one of the major sort of hubs of this kind of intellectual activity. So he's there, he's aware, he's reading. Past and Present has articles by Annales historians, some of the first translations of this into English, but he's very much a junior partner. It's not a friendship. Later, then he has friendships with some people on the other side of the channel, but not at this point. It's not at all the same dynamic, this sort of camaraderie, this solidarity that's in the CPHG. About towing the party line, I think, of course, it's easier for him to be a bit of a maverick at a time when everybody else is orthodox, right? So that's why you've got to read him in that 46 to 56 period. Because in that time, he felt himself to be a devoted communist, but independent. After 56, he feels much more under siege because he's decided to remain within the party. And so he becomes more publicly orthodox about the party line. It's quite clear to me that he wants to think independently. He thinks good history comes first, but he doesn't think that's incompatible with communism. And Britain is basically the only place in Europe in that period where he could have got away with that combination. Because if he'd been in France, for instance, he would have been thrown out of the party at some point before 56, I'm sure. Absolutely sure he would have been thrown out. So I think that it's because this was sort of such a sui generis entity that everybody was a little bit independent. Everybody felt they were a little bit independent. They had this alternative Oxbridge culture to draw on, which was not at all communist. But it's interesting. It would be interesting to think about the degree to which there's this sort of compatibility for him in his mind. Then there's Englishness. He does stand out. He was not parochial at all. Having said that, the stuff that he does in the 40s and 50s, stuff that he writes about, machine breakers, and then he writes about the crisis of the 17th century, and he produces the thing on Worlds of Labour, not Worlds of Labour, the Labour's Turn, collection of primary sources and all that. He does he makes his name first as a historian of Britain in the 50s. That's what he's known for. He's just known for having a very large address book of non-British contacts. And the reason he has that is because of language, and because he is entirely fluent in French. He becomes very comfortable in Italian over this period and begins to learn Spanish as well. So he is able to read things that others just simply aren't able to. And he speaks German, obviously, that goes without saying. So he's able to read things and get involved in debates which other people don't even know are happening. But he doesn't start to show a lot of that until the late 50s. And I think it's not a coincidence that this is also after 56. I think he's intellectually he's liberated, even though it sounds strange given that he's still in the party, but intellectually he's liberated after that to talk about rebels and to start writing about different parts of the world and so on. Finally, adult education. So I think this was less important to Hobsbawm than some of the others. I think that basically what he wanted was a nice job in Cambridge, and he never got that nice job in Cambridge. He was turned down for the chair for economic history in the early 70s, something which he remembered for the rest of his life. But he did teach at Birkbeck, and he spent his whole career teaching at Birkbeck, which was an adult education institution. So accidentally, he became part of adult education in Britain. But I don't think that he was nearly as committed as some of the others. That is, willing to abandon professional academia to spend time doing adult education. I think there was an elitist streak in him which sort of encouraged him to stay within the confines of academia, even a sort of deviant institution like Birkbeck, which wasn't the kind of place where a really brilliant scholar should have ended up in that period. I don't know if that answers all your questions.
I mean, it just seems like he's a paradox all the way through in this.
Absolutely.
Kind of paradox.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, okay, yeah. I also have a few. When was he born? The
No.
year?
The year of the Russian Revolution, 1917.
17. That makes him almost contemporary with another giant of 20th century history, Isaiah Berlin, who wrote a biography of Marx as his first published work. And I was wondering if his role in the polemics committee that you mentioned included responsibilities of tackling characterizations of Marxist historical figures related with 1848, centenary, all that comes together in that period. Also, I was curious, what caused the split of this group in 56? Is this the Hungarian crisis, the general ferment, post-Stalin, post-Khrushchev, 20th Party Congress, all that? Thirdly, I once read a chapter in this book called The Obstructed Path, Peter Hughes, I think. It's about French intellectual tradition in 20th century, and the first chapter focuses on the Annales and how Annales, in particular, Lucien Fabre and Marc Bloch, they built, as you said, address book and placed their people belonging ideologically on those lines in different jobs across France, French universities, which played a big role in the way Annales blossomed in the post-Second World War context. You just mentioned that he was rejected from Oxbridge, and I was wondering if part of the reason why this group split also had to do with its inability to place people in jobs across English universities, British universities. Was it, this continuum, and I'm sure Oxbridge representatives were there across the board. They still are in many universities today. So this inability to break through and hence that ferment, was it one of the latent reasons why this group ultimately split. And thirdly, and lastly, what are your ruminations about the art of biography writing? Because I'm also planning about it.
Okay. So Isaiah Berlin, so I need to look in a little bit more detail at their exchanges, if there are any. Hobsbawm, alongside all of this stuff, all of the, the ascetic struggle for, ideological purity, in the 1950s was also very much part of London's literary and cultural elite. And he used to hang out at various clubs, the Athenaeum Club, for instance. And he was somebody who really enjoyed spending time with artists, with musicians, with philosophers, with people who he, as a sort of in this sense, very Central European, he would consider to be intellectual. So at the same time as he's traipsing through the rain, or whatever he says in his romantic depiction of himself, he's also trying to sort of be part of that world. And some of his interest in jazz comes from that as well. So the interest in jazz both leads him into that world and then encourages him to remain part of it. And he met Isaiah Berlin in those circles, and he knew Isaiah Berlin, and I think he had respect for Isaiah Berlin in a sort of typically gentlemanly British way in which you can have respect for people who are ideologically completely different to you. It's very difficult to imagine something similar happening in France, but in Britain that's, I think they felt themselves to be kindred spirits, even though Berlin thought that Hobsbawm talked nonsense and vice versa. So there was a personal relationship between the two of them. Where it would be really interesting is to see whether he ever wrote, either was pushed to write or spontaneously wrote anything in response to Berlin's writings on Marx. That I don't know. And that I'd really like to find out.
I mean, Deutsche, of course, Berlin is not showing any of that English respect in ruthlessly undercutting Deutsche around this time. But anyway, yeah.
So it's certainly not a consistent thing. But I think my impression is that they saw each other as you would see the opposing person on the battlefield, right? And but again, I don't know the specifics, and I should really look that up. In terms of 1956, I mean, it's Hungary. For European communists, everything is really about Hungary. I mean, then of course there's a question of Khrushchev, and there's a question so what happens after Stalin, and how do we think about Stalin? But I think Hungary is an enormous blow because it makes manifest the fact that communism in Europe is really just a proxy for Soviet power, and regardless of the fact that there had been the show trials and that there'd been a period of high Stalinism, all kinds of purges, and people like Hobsbawm especially would have known about this, right? But Hungary just makes it very difficult to hold on to that line. So the two things together, because people start to leave. And this happens everywhere in Europe. People start to leave. So people say, I'm handing in my party card. And you look at the records, and even in branches, there are people who walk in and just throw their membership cards and walk out again. This is for them, this is a betrayal, and they perceive it that way. So I think that happened as much amongst intellectuals as it did amongst the kind of rank and file of the party. In terms of Anal and empire building, that's a really interesting point. The Anal were fantastic at building an empire, and in general, any sort of French intellectual current that succeeds has an empire attached to it, sort of prerequisite. In Britain, that doesn't really work in the same way, partly because empire building is less well established as a sort of method of academic promotion than it is in France. If you look at the career trajectories of the people there, right? So Dobb is basically the only communist at Oxbridge at all in the interwar period, but he has a job at Trinity College. He's a fellow of Trinity. Hill is a fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. They have these jobs from before the war. Afterwards, Victor Kiernan ends up in Edinburgh. He doesn't get a job at Oxbridge. Saville ends up in Hull. Hobsbawm ends up at Birkbeck. And then Raphael Samuel has a sort of para-academic career, which is not really located in any university. So I think that there's a little bit of McCarthyism going on that stops these people from establishing themselves. There's a little bit of that. I mean, Hobsbawm has a bit of a persecution complex about this, which is basically his way of saying, I didn't get a job at Cambridge. But I don't think that's why Well, I think they managed to have a remarkable amount of influence despite that, actually, despite lacking the sort of institutional leverage. And the whole turn to social history that is in the slipstream of the CPHG happens almost despite the lack of really explicit empire building and patronage in the UK. So that's sort of interesting. Then the last thing about the art of biographies, biographies. The British love biographies, right? So they're always writing biographies of people, particularly great men. I never really wanted to write a biography, and I don't know why I've ended up doing it. I think for me, what makes Hobsbawm interesting is the spaces he inhabits at different moments. And so if there's going to be any art to my biography, then it'll be in reconstructing those spaces. As I said at the beginning, right, this paper and this sort of section of the book more generally is about what makes a good historian, right, which kind of underpins the whole premise of the book, right? How do you go from being a bright Cambridge student to being somebody who sells so many books, and is read in Delhi and Rio and New York and and Paris and Rome and whatever. How do you do that, right? So there's some genius. I think you mentioned the word genius. I think there's creativity. There's good fortune. There's entrepreneurship, certainly in Hobsbawm's case. But then there are also the spaces in which he moves, and I think that's what really drew me to him as a figure. But not to uncover, which is often what biographies try to do. I don't think that's what drove me in this project. But it's a long conversation. I need to think about it a bit more. Thank you.
So I was just wondering, considering the open nature of the CPHE group, besides the fact that it included academics and school teachers and whoever would really like to join, how did this help the group, distinguish itself? And did you see, could one see much of a grassroots or subaltern impact that the other side of the membership was having onto the kind of theories and things the group was working on?
Very little. Very little part. I think the problem was partly that the Communist Party of Great Britain was tiny. Even at its height, it was minuscule, and it was dwarfed by the Labour Party, which in the post-war years, let's not forget, was in power. And so, it was, what was the rank and file? Well, it's not like there was a huge sort of rank and file to deal with. So that was a problem. Where were the ideas going to come from? And secondly, there was, as I sort of intimated in the paper, I think there was a strong elitist streak to what the CPHE actually did. And I think that those who were not professional historians were passengers. Doesn't mean they didn't learn anything, but I think that they were there to learn rather than to contribute. And the way, if you sort of try and read some of the minutes against the grain, it seems as if some of these less professional historians, what they do is they ask questions. They sort of say, well, what about this or what about that? And then the task is then for the professional historians who supposedly know more to answer that. So,
If I may just
of course,
follow
yeah, of course.
up. So, besides, what you're describing is mainly a passive presence that this populace maintains. So how do people like Donna Thorpe, who's not a professional historian and a member of the regular public play in, how do you have these major influences working their way into this elitist circle?
So in the case of Tor, I think it's because she was the patron of the group, and she made the group happen, and she made the group tick. Many of those who credit her, Hill, Saville, and others, credit her for being an outstanding editor, and so as being somebody who took their text, whatever they were writing, and really put it through the ringer. That's what they say. Her own output was fragmentary. She tried to write this book about Tom Mann, about this sort of British communist, and she was basically unable to square the kind of party line she had in her head with Tom Mann's very complicated trajectory, and so she never really finished this kind of biography, hagiography that she was writing. And so she herself didn't produce very much, but I think it's as a kind of instigator, as a sort of, as somebody who actively supported what they were doing. That's the way they describe it. That's the way they describe it.
questions. One is, could you come back to this? You said that anti-imperialism was not really on their agenda, which is something that I find quite striking at a time when Britain is losing its main colonies, including India, of course. And also, you mentioned that Hope's first PhD project was actually about Algeria. Now, I'm sure that he had in mind colonization and potentially, decolonization happened later, but at least, the whole conflict around Algeria's colonization. So how come, this was not more central to their discussions? That's something I find quite puzzling, if you have any explanations for that. The other question that I had in mind regards gender, because as you mentioned it yourself, it's quite striking to see, the kind of gender dimension of, that all professional academics would be men, and many of the non-professional academics
Others became housewives and all.
yeah, we become housewives, etc. And we know very well that the question of gender became really central to academia later, not in the 40s and 50s, but I wonder to what extent these interactions within the group somehow may have shaped some of his ideas. I don't know if I'm not familiar enough with the entirety of Hobsbawm work to know, if gender was ever a concern to him, but were you interested in the gender dynamics within that group? I know, for example, that recently there's been some studies about the gender dynamics within the Annales group, because again, it's very striking to see how men were very dominant, but it doesn't mean that women were absent. It's just that they were in the shadow, and they played a very important role. As some of them were trained as historians, but most of the time they would become assistants or maybe editors or housewives.
Yeah, both two really good questions about anti-imperialism, to sort of come back also to what you were asking earlier on. So this is really interesting, tiny sentence, he just flies by it in his memoirs, this project that he was doing on North Africa. When he was an undergraduate student at Cambridge, he received a travel grant to go to North Africa in the summer of 1938, which he did. He went for two months or something, 2.5 months. And using contacts he had in the international communist movement and so on, he met all kinds of interesting people, and he hung out with French colonial officials, and he learned about how they tried to deal with land, how they tried to deal with land disputes. So he, quite frankly, would have made for a much more interesting PhD than the thing he did on the Fabians. And of course, if you look in the French context, quite a few well-known intellectuals launched their careers by working on Algeria, right? So you could almost see this path being written for him, but he abandons it and then gets distracted by this sort of thing that I talked about today. He had a really intense interest in this, and again, there's sort of fascinating papers lying around about his involvement with the World Youth Congress in 1938-39, 37-38-39. He went to Paris usually once or more than once a year. He went to hang out with anti-colonial students, communists from all over the world.